Commander Spotswood, one of the field officers of the 2nd Regiment that was here in 1775. So if you see men in purple hunting shirts, that's who they are. They are members of the 2nd Virginia Regiment, and they're considered Virginia regulars. You'll also notice on the far side of the field to your left, you'll see some men in green. Those men represent the Culpeper Minute Battalion. They came from Culpeper, Fauquier, Orange County, a military district Virginia had formed in the Piedmont. The Culpeper Minute Battalion were largely armed with the American long rifle. This is a rifle-barreled weapon that is extraordinarily accurate and has a longer range than the common soldier's musket. There are basically two types of weapons on the field today. The majority of the troops on both sides are armed with a common smoothbore flintlock musket. Technologically speaking, this weapon functions in terms of its ballistical accuracy much like a pea through a straw. Think of the difference between the way, not considering their shape, think of the difference in the way that a basketball goes through the air and how a football goes through the air, because that's the principal difference between smoothbore weapons and rifled weapons. A musket ball from a smoothbore gun goes in a straight line out of a tube that has no rifling, and its maximum effective range is only about 100 yards, the length of a football field. The majority on both sides are firing smoothbore guns, but the majority of those men from Culpeper have rifle-barreled guns. And these weapons have a maximum effective range, depending on a man's eyesight and how well cut those groups are, to as much as 400 yards. There's also artillery on the field. And in this campaign of 1775, the Virginia camp has no artillery, although they expect some to arrive from North Carolina. You're seeing directly in front of you now the advance of British light infantry. Light infantrymen in the British Army of that time was a relatively new innovation, and it comes about as a result of lessons learned in the French and Indian War, where the tactics and the fights in the woods were fast-moving, loosely formed groups of soldiers who were useful for skirmishing, for testing the enemy, developing the military situation. You will notice their uniforms and their equipment are a little simpler, but one of the things that you may notice about them are the green plumes. In the British military of the 18th and early 19th century, that color green represents light infantry. They are generally men who are of a shorter stature, but very athletic, very strong in their way. That is an elite, relatively new innovation in the British Army, compared to the British Grenadiers. They are a longer existing group of elite soldiers, and you can always spot a grenadier by those tall black bearskin caps that they wear. The grenadiers are called grenadiers because in an earlier time they were given as one of their primary weapons a hollow iron ball filled with gunpowder with a fuse. They wore on their accoutrements, their leather gear, a brass or tin cylindrical case which contains slow match. Slow match is a piece of rope treated with chemicals so that it burns very slowly. You constantly have a glow on the end of your slow match. You can light the fuse of those grenades and hurl those grenades at the enemy or over a fortress wall or over entrenchments. The name still stands, even though they don't throw grenades as they once did. They're still called grenadiers. They are the tallest, the strongest, the smartest men in the regiment, and their duty, and proud they are of it, they are shock troops. And the Grenadier Company of the 14th Regiment of Foot will figure prominently into the Battle of Great Bridge. You're seeing the advance of both the soldiers of the 2nd Regiment, the local militia, and the Culpeper Minute Battalion are advancing on the British line with the light troops on the flank, where you would expect to see them to guard the flank against any sort of envelopment of the British line. Typically, in infantry units of the 18th century, you'll have field music, fifers and drummers. And for regular British infantry units, these men not only help to raise morale, but often the calls that they beat on the drums echo the officer's commands so that more of the troops can hear them. You'll notice, however, that the light troops, the light infantry, use a bugle because it's easier for fast-moving light infantry to use. British infantry has a uniform which to some extent is color-coded. I've already mentioned the green plumes of the light troops. But in the British infantry of the second half of the 18th century, you'll see the soldiers wearing red coats, but you will sometimes see different colors for the cuffs, the collar, and the lapels or revers of the coat. Those contrasting colors are called facing colors. And in the British Army, you might see a regiment that had white facings, you might see a regiment that had yellow facings, you would see regiments that had green and black and even red facings. Let's talk about the Virginians for a moment. Virginia had decided as early as the spring of 1775 that they were going to make the best attempt to clothe their soldiers in a garment which was unconventional to Western European warfare. On the American frontier had developed this garment called a hunting shirt. I'm wearing an example of a hunting shirt. It's a linen, plain woven linen fabric, heavy linen fabric, sometimes dyed different colors, sometimes left undyed. And as you go around here today, you'll see soldiers in various colors of hunting shirt. Typically, they have a little bit of fringe on them. They're cut very full. One of the advantages of a hunting shirt is that a man can bundle up and wear a hunting shirt over the top, yet the entire formation, insofar as the men have hunting shirts, will look uniform. General Washington, early in the Revolutionary War, made very clear he preferred the hunting shirt to be a garment worn by his soldiers because it was cheap to produce. The soldiers could wear it over their other clothing, but the other thing was it was believed by a lot of the British soldiery that anyone who wore a hunting shirt also carried the American long rifle, and those men were expert marksmen. So there's a psychological component to the use of the hunting shirt for American troops, and certainly here for the Virginia troops present, along with a few North Carolina volunteers that fought here at Great Bridge. Why purple? Why did the 2nd Regiment have purple hunting shirts? We don't know why they chose that color, but what we do know is in the regimental order book of the 2nd Regiment of the Virginia line, the entry for October 27th 1775, a month and a half or so before the battle here at Great Bridge, the entry for the day reads, "The company commanders are to ensure that their men are issued hunting shirts dyed of a purple color." So it's a matter of actual historical documentation that Colonel William Woodford, the commander of the Virginia Army that was here, that the 2nd Regiment wore purple hunting shirts. Another thing that may be a little difficult for you to understand is if you see the British artillery, you can see that those soldiers are wearing blue coats with red facings, and that seems difficult to understand because we think of British soldiers as wearing red coats, and they generally do. But the Royal Artillery, as it was known at this time, was an elite branch of the British Army, and in accordance with the King's wish, because every few years a document would come out, it was called the Royal Warrant, and it defined the clothing and the equipment of the British soldier. For a number of years before and long after this conflict, the British Royal Artillery would wear blue coats with red facings, with white tape, yellow tape on their facings and brass buttons, as opposed to the infantry, which almost always wore pewter buttons for the common soldiers. Now, while I'm using this as a vehicle to talk to you about military warfare in the 18th century, this skirmish is reminiscent of a number of skirmishes that took place before the actual Battle of Great Bridge occurred on December the 9th, 1775, and to some extent represents the first contact of Colonel Woodford's soldiers against Lord Dunmore's soldiers that was here. Colonel Woodford wasn't here yet. It took him 10 days to move his little army across the James River, which was no small task, even when people aren't shooting at you. But the fact of the matter was, among the resources the British military had under Lord Dunmore were a number of British warships in Norfolk Harbor. They had some smaller craft they could send up and down the river, and they did all that they could to interdict the ability of the Virginians to move their military force across the James from Williamsburg down here to this part of the Tidewater to oppose Lord Dunmore's forces in Norfolk. Norfolk was the largest city in Virginia at that time. Most people who came to Norfolk came by way of the sea, but there was one back door to Norfolk. There was a road that left Norfolk about 12, 13 miles from here and came over the Elizabeth River and all the swampland that was on either side of the Elizabeth River. Virginians, long before the Revolutionary War, had been able to create a causeway and bridge over this swampy ground, over the Elizabeth River. This was a bridge and a causeway system that was, I don't know, 300-400 yards long. And it would figure prominently into the story of the Battle of Great Bridge. And I'll talk more about that just before the 1 o'clock recreation of the Battle of Great Bridge. To a large extent,